Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. This week we're going to talk about a topic we've touched on before, but using a little bit different language and just see where it takes us. So the topic is the hedonic treadmill, or sometimes called hedonic adaptation. And basically it's a theory from psychology that says we kind of have a baseline level of happiness, and regardless of what happens, say you get a promotion, you get a raise or whatever, your happiness goes up a little bit, but ultimately it returns back to that baseline. And also conversely, if bad things happen, maybe a loved one passes away or something and you're depressed, you're unhappy for a while, eventually you do just kind of return to that baseline level. And it's called the treadmill because basically it's suggesting that chasing pleasure really doesn't do much to move our baseline level of happiness. We can get what we want, and that will, temporarily make us happy, but ultimately it's not going to really move the needle. So yeah, that's the topic. And what do you think of it, Nick?
Yeah, first time I'm hearing about the term, but I think it's even great naming, hedonic treadmill, because immediately everybody can relate to that. I think the fact that we do chase rewards, we do chase short-term goals in order to make us happy, but we all have to experience that in the long term they don't make us happy. I think it's the same with pursuing like short-term goals and our belief that once I achieve this thing, I'm going to be happy. But we always learn that it seems that these short-term rewards are not what makes up happiness. So yeah, I think it would be interesting to kind of explore that a little bit and try to define, or maybe end up with the definition of what is actually happiness and how would long-lasting happiness look like.
Yeah, I like this idea. Yeah, so thinking about my own experience, sure, I'm definitely maybe a little bit happier when I get something that I think that I need or that I want. But then again, I do notice it does tend to fall back down. So what is happiness? That's kind of a tough question, interestingly. I guess it's kind of a feeling of aliveness. It's kind of an interaction with what's happening immediately, right? So like if something happens that makes us happy, it does tend to be, something that's happening in the moment, something that you're really interfacing with real time in a sense, right? It's not so much in our heads. It's more like an immediate experience, I guess, kind of hinting at the idea of being present, like in terms of meditation. So maybe it's something that helps draw us into the present, that kind of almost like magnetizes us towards the present and brings our attention into the present. So if there's something pleasant happening, it tends to be much easier to be present. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't also enjoy things that are, generally considered a little bit less pleasant if we're present with them as well. At least that's kind of my initial stab at trying to figure out what happiness is.
Yeah, I think whatever you described there, I would name it as joy. So this being in the moment, this drawing you in the moment, the enjoyment, the pleasure, all of this falls for me under the category of joy. But I think we cannot experience joy long term. You cannot be in a state of pleasure all the time. Yet happiness is something that can last longer. So it's something that is perhaps even below the surface, feelings such as joy. And so if you imagine a happy person, one first thing that comes up there for me is what a quality of a happy person is. The person does not lose their happiness over circumstances. Usually, I think that's kind of the defining quality. So that means that happiness sort of transcends joy, because happiness can be present even in the face of difficult circumstances, unpleasant feelings, unpleasant situations, and so on. And therefore, I think it is, first of all, I think the term is often misunderstood. It's, we associate happy-go-lucky people with it, people that are always smiling, always happy. But I don't think that necessarily shows that somebody's happy. I think people not losing their base level confidence in life, even in the face of difficult circumstances, this is what displays happiness for me. And the ability to find enjoyment even if life does not work as we planned, for example.
Yeah. One term that's kind of coming to mind as you're describing this is kind of equanimity. I wonder if equanimity almost gets closer to what you're describing, just in terms of kind of this, consistency, this kind of being unperturbed by the perturbations, by, whatever comes up in the world. And I think, another term that comes to mind, thinking in terms of like meditation, is acceptance, right? And, I think in a lot of ways, it can be really valuable to look at our relationship to what's coming up. And so maybe one way to put happiness or define happiness is that you have a relationship to whatever can arise, and that relationship is kind of equanimity, right? That it doesn't move you too much, right? Because one kind of important aspect here that comes to mind is, well, if things change and your happiness is dependent upon external circumstances, then there's almost like a built-in swing, kind of like a swing of the pendulum that's going to happen. Like if you're really happy because of something that's happening externally, because nothing is permanent, right? Impermanence and change is the only constant, that eventually you're going to be unhappy because your happiness was dependent upon circumstances, right? And so that kind of suggests that our relationship to what happens is kind of, in a sense, a key to happiness.
Yeah. So we should not depend on external circumstances in order to feel happy. And this brings me kind of to one problem I want to highlight with happiness in general. I think there's a pitfall in that we think we attach our future happiness to some kind of goals. It's one of the qualities that we put in the future. Like when this thing happens, I'm going to be happy. When I achieve this, I'm going to be happy. And I think this is exactly what can put us into the treadmill that you described. It kind of puts the carrot on the stick in front of us, and I think it's our desire to be happy, to be fulfilled, is so strong that this is kind of an attack vector that we have as humans, and it's something that is being often exploited.
Yeah.
When you study psychology, you learn that there are certain triggers that we can exploit in people because of their desire to feel happy. And, some examples would be, casinos or those mobile games with in-game currencies, social media, all these things that promise us rewards and that trigger our dopamine system, but don't really give us any fulfillment because there's no meaning to it. But for some reason, there's still value in the short-term reward. And I think that this is what keeps us in those treadmills, even though we made the experience that, if I spend now an hour consuming content, or if I spend an hour playing this game, we know that it doesn't fulfill us. Actually, on the contrary, it leaves us kind of with a void. We still are drawn to pursue it because of the short-term relief it gives us. So I guess what I'm hinting at is that happiness can be mixed up with enjoyment and with short-term relief. And I think it creates a lot of problems for us.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I certainly find myself occasionally, or probably more than occasionally, chasing that kind of dopamine high. That's kind of what causes us to get into, habitual actions, right? Like doom scrolling on your phone, or right, it's that little hit of joy that we get when we find something that we like for a moment, right? Or when you see, your post gets liked, or, somebody responds to you, or whatever it is, right? Or you win a little bit of money, right? And then you kind of fall into this pit because it drops off, because it's not constantly there. And then that kind of compels you to seek it out again, right? In a sense, it's like an addiction. It really is. It's like a drug. And so what do we do about that, right? Like, there's the idea of like doing a dopamine detox or some sort of like dopamine fasting, right? Where you kind of avoid social media, where you avoid things that kind of give you that instant hit of joy, and instead just kind of focus. What do you focus on instead? I guess the moment, or what's your take on like dopamine fasting, or if we're not chasing happiness all the time like that, then, and given that that's kind of very culturally ingrained, like, well, that's the thing that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to set goals and achieve them, and that'll make you happy. And then, you got to set another goal because the happiness doesn't last. So where else do we put our focus if we're not putting our focus on that? What else do we do?
That's a tough question, but, I don't know. Let's try to come up with some solutions. So, yeah, we first have to understand that, or we can observe in ourselves, because I think everybody has some kind of addictions or at least like on a small level, or bad habits, or rewards that they use frequently to the level that it's become a habit. And what we can observe there is that we are giving basically the ability to produce dopamine to an external tool. That's kind of the agreement we made with that habit. It's like, whenever when I smoke the cigarette, it's when I'm going to get my dopamine, perhaps serotonin rush. I'm not sure, but dopamine for sure. And it's kind of in agreement with the external tool, and it kind of works. So in that sense, it can also be useful. It's the same with caffeine, that just produces focus at will in the moment when you drink it. So it's kind of a useful tool for us. But we realize that by giving away the ability to produce dopamine to the external tool, we lose the ability to produce dopamine at will, which is something I think we should be usually able to do. I think that if we get rid of all of those patterns and all of those tools where we externalize our ability to feel enjoyment to, if we get rid of them, we will naturally start to produce dopamine, serotonin throughout all of our day. So at least that's my experience. But how to get there? Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think the idea in most meditation traditions or in mindfulness, the idea would be that if we just focus on the present moment should hold enough pleasurable input for us to, on the extreme, feel ecstatic all the time. And, sometimes we have this moment in meditation where we're deep enough into the present moment where, this aha moment comes back that, oh my God, it's so nice to be alive. Or you hear birds singing, and this moment happens that you realize that's just enough for me to feel happy right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just one idea. Anything comes to your mind?
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so I think, like yourself, I've had these experiences where, whether it be through meditation or other type practices, where I can just kind of get almost like just kind of get on a high, really, where you're feeling really good for seemingly no reason. And I think that really should be, in a sense, it should be what we're aiming for, because it's very liberating, right? Because being on this treadmill and having to chase, these little hits of joy or the little things that bring us pleasure, ultimately it kind of doesn't work, and it's very dissatisfying, right? Like at a certain point, at least in my life, in retrospect, I recognize that, hey, I'm getting the things that I want, and it's not making me any happier. I feel a little bit happier temporarily, but then it's almost as if, it's kind of like an addiction. Like then you want the next thing even a little bit more, and it's almost like you're put into a pit of suffering just because you got what you want for a little while, and then you see that it's ultimately unsatisfying. Sometimes I think about people with massive amounts of money and billionaires, and in a sense we kind of look at them and think, well, that would be awesome, it would solve all my problems. But I imagine that a lot of them are probably the most miserable people, because they've gotten almost absolutely everything that money could buy, and kind of gotten to that point where, well, that didn't satisfy, and unless you can see an alternate path, that can kind of be very gloomy, I suppose, right? Like what are you supposed to do at that point? I've done everything that I was supposed to do, and it didn't pay off. It didn't help me get everlasting happiness. So I imagine there can be like a lot of almost depression in that whole path. So what do we do, right? I think in a lot of ways, of course, in meditation, there's kind of almost two different ways to approach it. There's like this idea of kind of cultivating like gratitude, for example, or cultivating love, where you're really just kind of focusing on it and thinking like, okay, well, if I practice gratitude, then it's going to be here more consistently. And while I do think that path has, some merit to it, and I think it does help, personally, I lean a little bit more towards the side of like, okay, what are the things that are, kind of making me unhappy, and what can I do to start changing my relationship to those things? It's not necessarily, kind of similar to getting what you want doesn't necessarily make you happy. Similarly, avoiding what you don't want doesn't necessarily fix things either. I mean, maybe if something's coming up and you somehow avoid it, you might get like a little hit of dopamine. You might feel good for a while, but ultimately that doesn't last either, right? And so I think a lot of it comes down to kind of removing the obstacles, kind of like, okay, well, examining why can't I be happy in spite of this thing happening that I don't want to happen. I guess that's kind of one way that I approach it. That definitely gets into the area of like surrender. When I'm not feeling good about something, can I just be okay being with that thing? And it seems like, that can be very transformative, in the sense that even the things that we maybe don't enjoy so much can become enjoyable when we can kind of just experience them more fully, experience them without resistance. My experience has kind of shown me that there's like this kind of texture to absolutely everything that we experience that can be very enthralling. I mean, it's the idea of like just being present, right? Even if it's something that, you typically see as unenjoyable, like, depression or something, right? Sounds maybe a little bit weird to say, but it kind of has a texture to it. It has, its own flavor, its own character. And if you can just kind of sit there and be with it, or pain, for example, right? It can become actually like a pleasurable experience, and all of our experience can become pleasurable. It's definitely not an easy place to reach. By no means would I say that I've reached a point where I feel pleasure in the face of pain, but sometimes I do. Sometimes when I really kind of get into it and just experience it for what it is, then it's so much more enjoyable regardless of what it is. So it's almost, and our tendency oftentimes when it comes to unpleasurable things is to numb ourselves, right? Which I think is almost like shooting ourselves in the foot, because then you're less aware. So, maybe another way to frame this is happiness is, a high level of awareness, or complete awareness of what's happening. I hesitate to use the word complete, but it's a high level of awareness of just being very, coming back to this term again, it's just being very present with what's there.
Okay, that's interesting. So now we start to talk about depression a little bit, right? If we define depression as the inability to be present with oneself, to be sort of cut off from their own feelings, I think what is especially fitting here is there's a type of depression called dystemic depression or dystemic disorder. And it's the type of depression where you're not particularly deep, you're also not manic. There's like manic depressions which go up and down in your phases, but this systemic one is the one where you feel below baseline, so you kind of feel shitty, but it's very constant, and therefore people also often don't identify, and then sometimes they have manic phases, but they always drop back to this below baseline. And I think those people are particularly susceptible to this hedonic treadmill, or perhaps these companies and tools that exploit this are maybe even pushing people into the systemic depression. And I think the underlying problem with that is that people are not really, so they're turning away from their direct experience towards things that distract them, that give them short-term relief, that perhaps still entertain them on a surface level, but on a deeper level, they're not able to really enjoy. And I agree with all those things that you said, that we once we let in the experience, we find enjoyable things even in not nice circumstances. All of that is true. The problem usually is that people are not willing to look at what is actually there, because before you're able to reach enjoyment, presence, perhaps happiness, usually we need to face some things that we are actually avoiding. And I think in the case of depression, a lot of the time it can be that we are avoiding a lost sense of purpose. I think if we lack purpose or meaning in our life, and we're not really willing to tackle it or face that, then we can get stuck in these kind of depressive, dystemic states. And probably to break through to presence and awareness, we would need to ask ourselves, what am I missing in my life? What is the thing that's preventing me from being present? And the answer will not be pleasant, most likely. It will be perhaps some regrets, or perhaps some unfulfilled potential, or the fact that we don't act on our goals, or the fact that we don't even maybe have goals, that we are not even sure what is our direction. So I think what I'm getting at here is that for me, happiness always relates to meaning and purpose. So I cannot imagine being fully happy and joyful without some kind of sense of purpose, contribution to some greater good. Although, there's this theory that existence itself is pleasurable enough, and if we just, kind of like you describe, if we just try to find the pleasurable thing in everything, that it should be enough for us to be happy. But, I always have the sense that I kind of came here for a reason, and trying to find that reason, trying to find what do I find purposeful, where do I invest my time, is the thing that creates happiness automatically. But when I stray away from that and I don't check in with it, then it happens that I can come into those kind of phases. I definitely never had like serious depression, but only maybe phases. And usually the solution for me is checking in with myself and seeing like, okay, where am I going? What is my purpose right now?
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely relate. I think one of the areas I struggle with that idea just in general is it can be very challenging to find like genuine and authentic purpose, right? Like I think, kind of one of the nuances that makes this idea of finding purpose very challenging, certainly for some people, for me, for example, is finding like genuine purpose, finding like what's really authentic for me. Because I can, that we have this tendency of kind of looking out into the world and comparing ourselves to others. And, then a purpose can, you can find a purpose that's maybe very inauthentic. It tends to be attached to, kind of just another part of this hedonic treadmill, maybe attached to our financial well-being or something, for example, or achieving certain goals like in your professional life. And I think, maybe one way to start to frame that or to find, to help kind of point us in the right direction as far as purpose goes is in terms of like you were saying, how we kind of contribute or how we can, improve the lives of others. It's, tends to be maybe a little bit overlooked, but I do find it might be perhaps a little bit cliche, but spending time doing like volunteering work and helping others and making other people happy, tends to make me happy as well. And, even if that, so maybe it's a place to start with finding purpose is just starting very general and seeing what feels authentic generally. And maybe a good place to start with that is, how can we make other people happy? And boy, I recognize that so much of what we're talking about is very nuanced and can easily be a very slippery slope, because there can also be this other approach to making other people happy where it's very like self-sacrificial and almost like being a martyr in a sense. And so, just kind of finding that balance, I think that's really an essential aspect, is kind of continually re-examining, what it is that we're doing in terms of finding purpose and what's the motivation, what's the intention behind it, really.
Yeah, I think that purpose doesn't even have to be, this such a high goal, such a, let's say, holy goal necessarily. I think purpose can also be, maybe somebody discovers by that they're actually hedonists and they are into pleasure and they're into partying. I think, that is enough for a purpose. Or it can be volunteering, maybe that's like a no-brainer thing. If you're really unsure about your purpose, maybe that's the first thing you can try and see if you find any fulfillment. It can also be, I think, self-realization, personal development, creating a family, maybe striving for harmony in your work environment. It can be on many different levels, and I think it can also shift during your lifetime. But one thing that unlocks purpose is self-discovery, because if you know your purpose, then you know yourself. So we know for sure, or my assumption is, that if you start on the path of self-discovery, you will learn what your purpose is, because you will start to, learn about yourself better. You will get to know yourself better. And so, this, I also have this image in my mind that if I think about a person that is really happy, I'm not sure the word that used in the beginning, but something like content, is a person that is in clear with themselves, that examined themselves, that analyzed what is my desires, what is my shadows. And if you reach that place of clarity, of self-discovery, where you know yourself, I think this is where you will have access to the question of what is your purpose and what is it that you can do with your time that will be fulfilling for you.
Yeah. I think that is a really good pointer. I do think that's a really good path to finding purpose, is really to examine yourself, to examine your life. interestingly, one idea that comes to mind is that it seems like as children, we almost have a clearer sense of purpose, or like what we really enjoy and what we want to do. And then as we grow up, and, oftentimes a lot of those early childhood dreams of what we might do can tend to be crushed by, well-meaning adults that just want to be practical, right? I think we sacrifice a lot of our self-awareness, a lot of our kind of self-realization to practicality, right? And that's where we get into kind of this idea of one of the paths to kind of self-discovery. It's almost a matter of subtraction, right? Like, you're not necessarily adding anything that's not already there, but rather you're kind of subtracting things. You're taking away, like, oh, well, I need to do this to be practical, right? Maybe you can set that aside for some time, and that can help you rediscover some of what maybe we knew a little bit better as children. I don't know. What's your thought around, like, whether or not we have a clearer purpose, whether we have kind of a clearer understanding of what makes us happy when we're children?
Yeah, I think we can always reconnect with your, let's say, inner self that is present throughout your life. And as children, I think we embody that inner self very purely. And along the way, while growing up, there's society, there's rules. We need to earn money, sustain our livelihood, and all of these things, all of these restrictions kind of make us abandon the desires of our inner or higher self at one point or another. And if we never follow up on them, I definitely think it can lead us into depression and sadness and inner desperation and grief for not pursuing what our desire was as a kid. And I think that for almost any desire, there's ways that you can even course correct as an adult later. Even if you realize this like late in life, I don't know, maybe you're in your 40s and realize, oh my God, I have been living in quiet desperation, doing something I don't really enjoy. And you can reconnect to your inner self, to your higher self, through perhaps meditation, just maybe reflection, just asking yourself. I don't think that this is such inaccessible knowledge. I think everybody deep down knows. You just need to find a way to access that again and really examine what is the, you can even ask yourself, like, what is the thing that really brought you joy as a kid? What is the thing that made time fly? What was the profession you had in mind as a kid? Reconnect with your inner child self if you want so, and open the conversation and try to find what that thing was. And I'm pretty sure that for any of those desires, we can find outlets to still realize these things, to live that purpose, even though if you missed out on 20 years. But you're gonna find healthy ways to give space again for whatever you found purposeful as a kid. And I think that's kind of a safe way back to enjoyment and purpose.
Yeah, that's funny. This is super relevant to me in my life right now. I mean, you pretty much just described my life, right? Like, I'm in my very early 40s, and I'm kind of at this point where, upon reflection, you said, and I forget who originally said this, but most men, or we'll say most people, lead lives of quiet desperation, right? I really just love that. I feel it's so true, right? It rings very true for me, where I've kind of reached this point where I recognize that I'm not happy. I've spent most of my life trying to do things, that I thought I should do, rather than, in a sense, maybe it's because I'm following the rational thought of like, oh, well, I got to make money. This is an easy way for me to make money, so I'm going to do this, instead of those other things that I was maybe more interested in that were maybe more challenging, perhaps even. I think in a lot of times that there is a certain challenge. There is definitely, currently, as I'm going through this myself, I'm going through, trying to potentially change my career pretty significantly and re-examine what I want to do. And so I'm considering doing things like going to career fairs, because in a sense, I don't exactly know what I want to do. And in the past, I've always just kind of, almost thrown a dart at the wall and just go like with whatever it hits. In a sense, I mean, there's a little bit more planning and rationality to it, but that hasn't really worked for me. It's done well materially, right? But it hasn't really done well for me in terms of my happiness and my baseline level of happiness and my sense of purpose and fulfillment. I don't feel like I really have that, and so I'm doing the exact things that we're talking about here and trying to discover like, well, what is that purpose? How do I find that? And there is like a lot of self-discovery. There's a lot of kind of exploration, just putting yourself out there and trying different things, really, which is something that I personally neglected a lot as a child. I more had the sense of like, oh, well, I know that I should do this or that I should do that, or I think I'm going to like this. And then, 5 years, 10 years down the road, I'm like, oh, well, maybe that actually wasn't the best decision. But, for better or worse, we are at where we're at. And, to kind of accept where you're at and recognize, hey, maybe I'm not happy and I'd like to change things. And, starting to make it can be fairly trivial. It can be just, finding hobbies that you enjoy or something, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be like a career change. For me, it is going to be pretty big, I think. But I'm still kind of in the weeds. I'm in the chaotic part, and I don't really know what my direction is. But it feels kind of exciting to be exploring it, and almost the process in and of itself can kind of bring some joy and kind of help motivate you, just because it's exciting and it's kind of the unknown, and there are a lot of potential challenges, and I don't know what it's going to bring. That's fun.
Yeah, it's definitely a process. So we have to realize that it's not, you're not going to come up immediately with this thing, or maybe it happens for some people, in a dream, you discover, oh my God, I should be a yoga teacher. And, that's the thing you do. Most likely not. Most likely it's going to be a long process, because you have been conditioned differently, right? I mean, society works in a way that it doesn't produce people that follow their desire. It produces people that are like efficient workforce. It's like, This is what we need. And hopefully, society is going to shift in a different direction. But, now you're left with, 20 years of conditioning in a completely different direction. But the good thing is, on the inside, perhaps you had this feeling, you had this calling that, there's more. There was actually something else that you were here to accomplish still in this lifetime. And the good thing is you're hearing it. You're giving it voice. Yeah. Like you're taking it seriously to the degree that, you're thinking, okay, how can I pivot my career, basically? How can I do something completely different? And that is not rational at all, especially if you have been, successful in your career otherwise. But taking yourself seriously and saying, no, there's something more that I desire and I want to do, even though you're not even sure what that is. That takes a lot of courage, but that speaks for the fact that you're reestablishing a relationship with your inner or higher self, and that you're giving it the attention that it has been lacking over the years. And I think we can, since these parts separated from us or have been buried, usually, when we were kids or teenagers, whenever life got serious for us, and we started thinking about, no, there's probably a safer career for me, and this is what we started pursuing. That means that you're dealing with, and let's say, not fully developed higher or inner self. You're dealing with a child, basically. Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, you can think about how would you help your kid if it would be in the same position. Imagine you have a kid that is like, 10 years old and is really lost, and it's like, oh my God, I really don't know which school to pick, or what hobby to pick, or what is my purpose. How would you help that kid find whatever it is that is fulfilling? And just do the same thing with yourself, and see your inner self basically grow and develop those desires. And yeah, I think it's really fun process, but as you say, it's a process. So, also try to find some pleasure during the process.
Right. Yeah, I think in a sense, one phrase, another kind of cliche phrase that comes to mind is kind of following your heart instead of following your head. Like I've spent most of my time following my head, following what seems to be rational and, sometimes what's easy, and avoiding the challenging things, avoiding things that I'm maybe a little bit more fearful of. So kind of leaning into your discomfort a lot as well. These are all kind of like pointers, right? I mean, they're not total solutions in and of themselves, but they're vague compasses, I guess you could say, right? They can kind of point you in the right direction, and following the things that you like genuinely enjoy. And that's, I say it that way to kind of distinguish it from the things that kind of just give us that quick dopamine hit, right? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a good place to leave it. Do a shorter episode this week. What do you feel?
Yeah, I think we discovered a lot. I have more clarity also for myself on how I see happiness. And yeah, the talk at the end was definitely inspirational also for me to inquiry again, like, am I doing the thing that is, my highest excitement? What is actually my goal right now? So yeah, let's end it here.
Cool.